It's great to hear that introduction, but if I were grading it, I'd probably give it a C. So thank you, Mark. But the reason I give it a C, he didn't say a word about the grandchildren. I mean, he can, if he doesn't mention the grandchildren, it's automatically a C. But I know y'all understand what I'm talking about. Today, we're going to talk about this thing called purpose. And as I've wandered around the audience, it's fun to hear you play to me, even before you knew what I was talking about, the importance of purpose. Particularly, we're in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a wonderful economy, and yet if you're in things like commercial real estate, it's sort of a white knuckle drill. And I was telling Jeff that in 2008, I was in Silicon Valley talking to a number of folks, and all of a sudden the beeper started going off, and you could see the blood drain out of their faces. And it was when the crash was happening, and then we quickly saw the fears that we had, and how do we combat those fears? And we said fear plus faith equals courage. So it's a time for many of us to have courage as we're anticipating, and this whole topic of resilience is really critical, I think. I say it's a critical life skill from cradle to grave, but in particular, if you're going through as a businessman the various ups and downs and body slams that happen to you, and the real pressure is not for yourself, but the people that you're responsible for. You want to care for them, their livelihood. And the net is that resilience is awful important, to be resilient as a person and to be resilient as a leader and help others be resilient. So we're going to talk about that topic, but I'm going to attack it first from this notion of purpose. You see the quote on here. This is Robert E. Lee. He said of Stonewall Jackson, "He advances my purpose as the needle to the compass," meaning staying on true north. He accomplishes my intent. He heads straight in that direction. So I think purpose is always important. It's critical. At the National Center, we provide dignified work, not to work, but to achieve purpose and self-esteem. And all of us are that way. As men, we need to be doing something that makes a difference. So we'll talk about that. And purpose, for many of us in the world of Christian ease, we will often call that calling. And so we're going to dive into this notion of purpose and calling here. And so why not start with the scriptures in Matthew 4:21, 18 through 21. It's the story about Jesus calling the disciples. And it's very quick. It says, and now Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And it says, immediately they left their nets and followed him. So you have this process, this calling by Jesus, and this following by the people that hear his message. So, and then it goes on. It gives another iteration of that with James and John, sons of Zebedee. But the point is, Jesus calls us. And one, he calls us to faith, but then he calls us to a couple of other things. And I'm going to talk about that for a moment. Let me tell a brief story. In Korea, on the demilitarized zone, you can go ahead with that next slide, Gene. In Korea, on the demilitarized zone, North Korea has the largest field artillery army in the world. They can put 100,000 rounds of artillery on Seoul, Korea, some of them conventional or chemical type of unconventional, in the first 6 hours of the operation. So it's not a trivial thing. We were there in Korea in 1998, and something was happening in the Middle East, and the National Command Authority decided to take all of our intel assets that were hovering over us in Korea and move them to Germany and to the Middle East and all this stuff. And so target solutions that had been in place for decades all of a sudden went out the window. The North Koreans were smart enough to know this, and they played fruit basket turnover. We had a crisis in Korea as a result because we didn't know where their weapons were. And the net result was that I went to the DIVARTY commander, Division Artillery, and said, "Colonel, you got to figure this out." And he said, "But my major that handles this just left. Korea, fast rotation. I don't have anybody to handle it." And I said, "Colonel, I'll be back at the end of the week, figure it out." Okay? And so I went back at the end of the week. And as it turned out, this young sergeant, female, that was in that shop, just a neophyte, she had done the work. And she had done it better than the major would ever have done it. And we saw that, and then she went on to be a superstar. But we saw that simple empowerment of that young lady in the presence of need made all the difference in the world. She saw that somebody believed in her. She saw that she had purpose. What she did made a difference. And so I took a premise from that, and the premise is simply that the question, do your troops, do your factory workers, do your kids, do your employees know that you need them? That's awful important. Okay, now where does that come from? Well, Jesus was on the Sea of Galilee. You recall after everything had gone down and he had risen again, and they're scratching their heads and wondering, and the disciples go up there, they fish. Jesus says, cast your net on the other side. He cast the net on the other side, and they caught a big draft of fish. And that particular story talks about how Jesus had his own fish on the fire. Maybe they're gold-plated fish or something, I don't know. But he had fish on the fire. It said, and they were dragging their fish to the shore. He said, come, let us have some of the fish which you have caught. Some of the fish which you have caught. I think that's one of the most profound leadership statements in all of Scripture. You know, the Bible is the world's greatest leadership manual, and there's one of them. Come, let's have some of the fish which you have caught. It talks about the same thing. It talks about empowerment. I choose to need you. Bring your gifts, your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations. I choose to need you. And so I mentioned a calling to faith. This is a calling to service. And these types of callings occur in our seasons of life. And we'll get a calling for a very specific thing. My calling in life right now is returning healthy veterans to America. Each one of you has a calling. And as we'll see, this calling, this sense of calling, is very important to our whole ability to be resilient. Jesus, bring some of the fish which you have caught. It's all about empowerment. I want to tell one more story in this regard related to calling. This is a troop formation. This is not the right one, but when I commanded in Korea, I had 18,000 people in the U.S. formation, and then I had another 12,000 that were Korean in this large counter-fire task force is what it was called. The net is that I needed a simple way to communicate truth and the acid test to my leaders across cultural lines and across lines of rank and all that. And God gave me an acid test, and it's simply, do your soldiers, do your troops, I'll say, know your voice in the dark. If they know your voice in the dark, it's a powerful military metaphor because it implies that you're checking on that soldier's safety in the foxhole or on the flight line or on the deck of a ship. Do your soldiers know your voice in the dark? And it's not just the dark of night, it's dark of doubt, despair, discouragement, woundedness. Do your soldiers know your voice in the dark? If they do, then there's a strong bond of trust and confidence between the leader and led. That's where you want to be as a leader. That's the way Jesus led. And then, oh, by the way, troops, or again, do your children know your voice at night or around the dinner table? Do your employees know your voice on the factory floor or in the cubicles? You get the point. Do your soldiers know your voice in the dark? Do your troops? That's really a powerful leadership principle that God brings out of the Scriptures. So where'd that come from? It comes from John 10. My sheep know my voice. So as we really dive into the fundamental principles of leadership in the Bible, we find some incredible vignettes from the life of Jesus that helps us. And then when you look at this, my thought is that, okay, Jesus calls us to faith, he calls us to service, but he also calls us to listen. We have to listen to that still small voice of Jesus, because if he's going to call us and if we're going to follow, there's got to be a listening process in the middle of that. And some of the most teachable moments in time are when we've gone through a body slam, we're stuck in trauma or transition, the world's upside down, and then we have the sense to listen to that still small voice, and we can hear God guiding us and comforting us and turning us one direction or another. And I want to talk about all of this now in the context of resilience. So this is what you'll find in one of the books that's available over here. This is the resilience life cycle. And you start off on the left side. It's like ahead of the storms of life. Paul Tournier, Swiss theologian, said, "We fall the way we lean." We fall the way we lean. And so it makes sense ahead of time, ahead of the storms of life, to be leaning in the right direction. That's why we do things like this on Friday mornings, so that we help each other lean in the right direction. And so that's the ounce of preparation that's worth the pound of cure. And that's what we do, and it's part of this thing called building resilience. You certainly see this in the real estate world that I alluded to. So you build this resilience ahead of time. You go into some of the literature, and there's like 6 different techniques that I recommend. Like knowing your friends, knowing your enemy, know your calling, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then weathering the storm. That red thing is the storm of life. It represents many different things. And I say there's 2 bookends of trauma. On one bookend, it's the tornado. The other bookend is the hurricane. The tornado is maybe the car wreck that you didn't expect coming to this or wherever. The tornado is maybe the instant diagnosis of something that you didn't expect. Maybe it's the IED going off in combat that changes your life forever. That's a tornado. But on the other end of this spectrum, you have a hurricane. You see a hurricane coming from a long way away. But there's not a lot when it gets there that you can do about it. You can prepare. You're wise to prepare, but it's overwhelming. So a hurricane might be like understanding a treasured relationship is unraveling before your very eyes. Understanding that maybe cancer is gnawing away at your body and you're working it, but there's not a lot you can do about it. Or, frankly, if you're in business, maybe looking over the horizon and understanding that a lot of the economic indicators are pointing all in the wrong direction, and you recognize you have a year or 2 or 3 of rocky road ahead of you. And it sort of gives you a pit in your stomach, but you're not for sure what to do about it. And so this whole resilience life cycle and this resilience training is useful in helping you know what to do about it, take very constructive means to deal with this uncertainty and the things that are striking you. And then finally, you see bouncing back. Bouncing back is a 2-part process. Introspectively, we look through the rearview mirror, and we do things like guard our primary relationships, achieve a position of forgiveness and gratitude. We grieve well because we've lost something. And then we look forward, and we regain our vital optimism as we look through the windshield. And it comes from comforting others with that which we've been comforted, and from something called revalidate your calling. And I'm gonna dive through this with a look at calling itself. Another story. This is Chaplain Robert Preston Taylor. 1941 was not a great year in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor, you get the point. In 1941, Robert Preston Taylor was an Army chaplain, and he went to the Philippines. He'd been there 3 months, and then he finds himself on the Bataan Death March. 68,000 Allied soldiers were captured by the Japanese, and they were marched to the prisoner of war camp, and about half of them died along the way. Disease, bayoneted because they couldn't go fast enough. You get the point. They got to the prisoner of war camp, and the chaplain had been helping them all along the way. He was really a soldier's chaplain. They got to the prisoner of war camp. He heard through the grapevine that there were guerrillas operating outside the camp that had medicine that was almost life-saving because of those tropical infections and things they would get. He would sneak out, grab the medicine, come back. Sneak out, come back. And then one night, he was coming back and he got caught. And they threw him in the hell box. And the hell box was about a 4-by-4 foot place in the jungle, bamboo over the top. He would get rainwater now and then. And he was there for days, and then he was there for weeks. And as he was there, all of a sudden, they pulled it off, and he was blinded by the light, and he could barely stand up. His fellow prisoners held him up, and he was like this. And as some of you as chaplains or caregivers or pastors would know, his fellow prisoners looked at him and they said, "Chaplain, what's the good word?" It's like, give me a break. I've been, okay, give me a break. What's the good word? But he was ready in season. And he said, "Men, do not doubt in the dark what you believed in the light. Do not doubt in the dark what you believed in the light." That's really a powerful principle. And that implies that there's some things we can do in the light of day, in the light of Atlanta, Georgia, on a Friday morning, some things that we can do that prepare us for the dark. And let's do everything we can to get ready. It's prudent, it's wise, get ready so that when the dark of night comes, we recall back to the light of day, and then we're on a firm foundation. I think you get the point. And so next slide illustrates that. In this resilience life cycle, ahead of time, it is so important to know your calling. And there's not a better place to figure out your calling, both your calling in faith, but your calling in service, and your calling to listen, than in a group like this. And that's all preparatory. And so let's continue with another illustration. This one's very quick, but it talks about Daniel Webster Whittle. Anybody heard of Daniel Webster Whittle? He was a Union soldier, and he had his arm shot off at the Battle of Vicksburg. That's pretty bad. But then if it wasn't bad enough, then he was captured by the Confederates, and he's sitting in a Confederate prison. It reminds me in some ways of the Apostle Paul or whatever in prison. Well, what did he do? Well, he remembered his call. He gained mental altitude, he remembered his call, and God gave him this song that you may be familiar with. It starts off, I know not why God's wondrous grace to me he hath made known. Maybe you've sung this in church if you're singing hymns sometimes. Nor why unworthy Christ in love redeemed me for his own. That's what it says. And then you know the chorus, but I know whom I have believed in and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which he has committed unto me against this day. So that's really powerful. And that's the testimony of a man who remembered his calling in the depths of despair, was able to gain altitude. With height comes perspective, and he was able to rise to the occasion. And there's many examples of that, but I'll just give that one. And then I'd like to move forward one more time. Remember your calling. And now this whole notion of bouncing back, it's really tough to do that. After World War I, the British, they lost over 100,000 people in the Battle of the Somme. And they said, we don't think we'll ever be able to gain our vital optimism as a nation, regain it. And yet they were able to do that, and World War II, et cetera. So that's national resilience. Well, personally, it's the same thing. Many times when we get body slammed, and it's really a deep betrayal, or it's a hurt, or something that really continues to grind with us, we really have to sort of loosen our grip. And then as we're going through this bounce back stage, we have to go through those things. One of them is forgiveness. When I talk to men's groups, out of all the resilience tips, if you will, the main one is forgiveness. I'll speak at a group like this, and then I'll have 10, 15 guys that come up, and I need to forgive my ex. I need to forgive my business partner. I need to forgive this or that. There's always a lot of unforgiveness in a crowd like this. So, I just say it is really relevant to be able to forgive, loosen your grip. And the reality is, bitterness is the poison we drink to kill someone else. And so how crazy is that? And so forgiveness is a part of this bouncing back process. Nancy Lee DeMoss, some of you may know that name, Campus Crusade lore and things. She wrote 2 books. One is Choosing Forgiveness, and the other one is Choosing Gratitude. Forgiveness and gratitude are the antidotes to bitterness, and they're very important. Okay, so this next slide, please. We have a guy named Louis Zamperini. Anybody heard of him? Yeah, I guess so. Unbroken. He was the Olympic runner, great Olympic runner, and decided to go into the Air Force, World War II, was in an air crew, shot down, life raft, 70 plus days at sea. It was pretty tough, obviously. The air was going out of the raft, and you could feel the shark's fins underneath, scraping the bottom, and you get more and more lost air. Pretty desperate. One of the guys had really died because he gave up. Well, the good news is that then they were rescued. The bad news, they were rescued by the Japanese. and then they were put in prisoner of war camp. And because he had been such a visible person on the Olympic running stage, he was tortured mercilessly by a guy named the Bird. Okay, and so Louis Zamperini came back. He was serious post-traumatic stress. He was drinking heavily. He had all sorts of challenges, and he didn't know if he was going to make it or not after that terrible experience. And so this is the rest of the story as he revalidated his calling. Go ahead, please.
So I went forward in the meeting and made my confession of faith in Christ, and I couldn't believe what happened. While I was still on my knees, my life changed in a matter of moments, because I knew I was through getting drunk, and I knew that I forgave my guards, and I knew it was a miracle because I forgave the Bird. And that was the first night. First night in 2.5 years I didn't have a nightmare, and I haven't had one since.
And Louis realized that God can forgive him for all the rotten things he did in his life, that he ought to be able to forgive those that had done him wrong. So forgiving the guards and the Bird was actually salvation for him. It really turned him around in an instant.
He decided he needed to test his forgiveness to see if he really had truly achieved it. And he went back to Japan to meet the guards who had abused him so terribly. And he went to Sagama prison where they were all being held for war crimes.
He went to every single one and looked him in the eye and told him that he forgave him for the treatment that he received when he was a prisoner of war.
He felt no animosity. He just felt compassion, and they couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. It was a wonderful experience. He knew he had truly forgiven then.
I think it's incredible that he forgave them. That's a lesson that he taught my father and me. By hating somebody, I'm not hurting them, I'm only hurting myself. You can forgive anybody. Forgiveness is always possible.
Amen. Forgiveness is always possible, and that's inspiring to see. And what was he doing here? He had a teachable moment in his life. It's one of these moments where he could grow. The term is called post-traumatic growth. In 1980, some people, researchers at University of North Carolina, Tedeschi and Calhoun, they did a research study and they reverse engineered some Vietnam outcomes. They looked at Vietnam veterans and then they saw how they were doing. They assessed that, and then they went back pre-Vietnam and they assessed what were their resilience building, faith, family, other factors that they listed in that study. What were those things that allowed them to have the response they did as a result to their Vietnam trauma? Well, what they discovered is that it was bipolar. And some people that had really invested heavily in building resilience, getting ready ahead of time, then would do this. And that's where the term post-traumatic growth came from, versus those that would spiral downward because they didn't. So we all face a fork in the road when we have these body slam moments. And at that fork in the road, the question is, have we developed the right reflexes to trauma ahead of time, so that we're more inclined to go upward instead of downward. And so that's an important principle, and that's the fundamental research basis that all of that I've shown you is based upon, that it does make sense to invest ahead of time because it pays dividends downstream. So that next slide, if you have it there, Gene. Okay, this sort of summarizes what I've talked to you about. You know, this calling is the golden thread of resilience. Ahead of time, know your calling. And the question today is, okay, do we know our calling? Is it something that's sort of flopping a bit? Whenever we go through trauma or transition, it's a golden opportunity to not just know our calling, remember it, but then revalidate it. And the revalidation, I spend a lot of time in, I think it's chapter 8 of the Resilience God Style book, talking about what revalidating your calling looks like. And one of the key tasks, one of the key tools is to develop your own personal board of directors. And it's a group of people around you that understand you from different angles. Maybe a pastor, maybe your wife, probably, your best friend, your business partner. But these are trusted people that you gather for a limited duration of time to truly figure out what your next season of life looks like. And so that's the type of thing that a group like this is ideally suited for. Ideally, that's one of the ways you can help one another is by knowing your calling, remembering your calling when one of you is in the middle of trauma, and then after the fact, revalidating your calling and listening to God's still small voice, and He'll put us back on the straight and narrow. Condoleezza Rice, you're familiar with the name. She was president of Stanford for a period of time. And she would play she's a concert pianist, she would play at a little church around the corner. And she came home one day and she was lamenting to her mother, the pastor can't carry a tune in a bucket. And she was playing all this fine piano stuff, and the pastor would go off Never Never Land and sort of, from her perspective, ruin the performance. So her wise mama said, well, Condi, when he does that, you just go back to middle C, and they will find you. And so the point is, and then she starts her Christian testimony, because middle C for her is the person of Jesus Christ. Okay, so for all of us, it makes sense when we go through all this turmoil and we're revalidating, to go back to middle C, to start with those fundamentals and then figure out what God wants us to do next is awful important. Let's go to Abraham Lincoln. You recognize the picture. Gettysburg was happening in 1863. Around the time of Gettysburg, Lincoln was distraught. You can understand, it's tough at the top. And he told his young aide, let's go walk on the streets of Washington. They started walking around, and they wandered to the National Cathedral. In the National Cathedral, there was somebody preaching a sermon in the main area there, so he and the young aide stopped in a vestibule, and they listened. They could hear it, and the aide was anxious to know that President Lincoln was really jiving on this or whatever. And so the aide said, Mr. President, you like what you're hearing? And the president was silent. Again, the president was silent. And then finally the aide continued to pester him. Mr. President, do you like what you're hearing? And Abraham Lincoln said, well, I love it. The pastor's content is incredible. He's a great communicator. So the aide said, well, so you loved it, Mr. President. And the president said, no, I think it was a total failure. And, the aide was, what's this all about? When President Lincoln said, he failed to ask us to do anything great. He failed to ask us to do anything great. I think that's pretty profound, and so to be honest, I don't want to fail to ask you folks today to do a couple of great things. And the first challenge to greatness here, the next slide, Gene, is just to remind you of the power of purpose. Okay, purpose is awful important. Each of us here, you need to recognize this in the very depth of your soul. Each of you here has been created by the living God for a unique purpose. And as you discover that purpose, and then as you live out that purpose, it truly does provide the abundant life and the joy and all that Jesus talks about. And then as part of that purpose and call, this whole notion that I've laid out for you of knowing it, remembering it, revalidating it is awfully important. And then as I mentioned in that quote at the very first, keep your needle pointing north, okay, to the compass, and then also stay on middle C. Now, in the world of what I'm going to show you here, you see the book cover, Resilience God Style. Resilience God Style was once called Resilient Warriors as part of the Resilience Trilogy, and then I updated Resilience God Style because it became obvious that it wasn't just valid for military warriors and things, but it was valid for the general population. And so we established a course at Liberty University. It eventually led to 8 courses in resilience, and there have been over 10,000 students going through that curriculum in the last decade. And it's not because Bob wrote the book or anything. It's a really critical life skill, and I started on the resilience glide path with the Army. The Army had devoted much of their millions and billions of dollars to establishing a resilience program. The problem was it was all about jump higher, run faster, try harder, and they left out the secret sauce. And so my real passion was to put the secret sauce of Jesus Christ, right back into this whole resilience equation because I knew that that's where the power comes from. And there's a lot of great techniques, but the power comes from the person of Jesus. And so that's what this book is all about. It walks you through that whole resilience life cycle, the before, the during, the after. It gives a lot of techniques. And then, frankly, there's a workbook, a video series. It's on Right Now Media. There's a game over here. I just brought one copy of the game. You can look at it at the table for the purpose of transferring values across generational lines. Resilience is a critical life skill, I said, and we can't be teaching our children too early about resilience. And a lot of this resilience work came out of object lessons with my grandchildren working. That's where the tennis ball egg came from. That's where the bitter lemon eating contest came from, to teach about bitterness and forgiveness. So you get the point. I don't want to provide a sales pitch here, but I just want you to know this is a resource. And over on the table, you have a QR code, and at the end, you'll have a QR code that allows you to go to a blog. I've written over 40 very specific blogs on specific areas of resilience that you might find beneficial. Okay, next is the second challenge. It relates to leadership. Lead others to do the same, to be resilient. This Resilient Leaders book is just the next level up. It takes the resilience life cycle and it talks about it from a leader perspective. For instance, instead of dealing with the storm, how do you lead in extremis? How do you as a leader lead other people through crisis? So you ratchet that whole model up one level. And then it comes from Psalm 78:72. David shepherded them according to the integrity, the character of his heart, and the skill, the competence of his hands. And as I wrote the book, at the very end, I said, okay, character and competence, well, what connects them? Something's missing here. And the Lord just showed me over time that the bridge between character, our deeply held core values, and competence, application of those values in the nitty-gritty of life is this thing called wisdom. Okay, so my favorite chapter in that book is about wisdom. How do leaders wait? How do leaders decide? And so forth. You get the point. Okay, so the acid test, recall here, do your troops know your voice in the dark? And then do your troops know that you need them? And then do you know your troops? And then finally, we're challenged by the Apostle Paul. He sort of summed it up for all of us. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call, the upward purpose of God in Christ Jesus. And then on the last slide, just a reminder, says, he advances to my purpose as the needle of the compass to north. And that's awful important for us to be able to say that we advance to God's purpose. We advance to his purpose in our lives as the needle of the compass to north. And so that's all my prepared remarks. The only other thing I would say to Jeff Terry is go Army, beat Navy, I think is correct. Okay, so with that, it's good to be with you. God bless you. Thanks a lot. I'll be around.